Hello and welcome friends. In Indian economy in unit 4 up till now we have discussed about poverty and types. We had talked about the poverty line and how it is fixed, the various methodologies. We did a comparison as well of various methodologies. We talked about PPP, we talked about poverty measurement, causes and the various schemes implemented to eradicate poverty. Then we started talking about economic inequality and we came to know of the Gini index. And then we started talking about unemployment. We understood what are the basic definitions of somebody who is a fully employed individual or somebody who can be called to be a worker. We talked about the various types of unemployment and then we started talking about the measurement of unemployment rates. We talked about the various estimates which are made by NSSO. Right? Now, let us talk about unemployment in India and let us talk about the current scenario. As far as India is concerned, the figures that we have for 2011-12, the unemployment rate was 2.2%, but it has increased to 6.1% in 2017-18. And naturally, once we have reliable figures for the pandemic period, that is in the 2020-21 and 21-22, more importantly in the 2020-21 financial year, we will understand that the unemployment rates must have spiked, must have risen sharply in these times. It is also found that the unemployment is more in urban areas than in rural areas, though people migrate to urban areas in search of employment, but then we find that unemployment is more in urban areas than in rural areas. The reason is that in rural areas, people are already engaged in agriculture, cultivation. That is not the case with people in urban areas. So that is why many times you find that unemployment rates are higher in urban areas than in rural areas. And let us also take a little time to talk about the job scenario in India. Where do we have most of the jobs? Because when we talk about unemployment, we need employment, we need jobs, and we need to understand what the job scenario is and which sector do we have most of the jobs. So please understand, I hope you recall that earlier also I have talked about organized sector and unorganized sector. So I talked about this in earlier sessions. One of the earlier sessions I had taken up, and basically we need to understand first of all what is the difference, and then we'll understand that in organized sector there is only 10 to 13% of the workforce which is employed. Many a times this figure is even lower, ranging from 8 to 10%. In unorganized sector, however, we have the lion's share of jobs. So 87% of the workforce is engaged in India in the unorganized sector. Now, basically what I'm trying to tell you through this particular comparison is that most of the jobs are generated in the unorganized sector as far as Indian economy is concerned, though it is not a very good thing for the Indian economy, but this is the reality. Many a times organized sector is also known as the formal sector, and the unorganized is also called the informal sector of the economy. Now let us understand the difference between the two. Now organized sector is public and private sector establishments hiring more than 10 workers. So public and private sector establishments which generally hire more than 10 workers, they not only this, they also provide better wages and allowances because their focus is not just to extract the maximum from their workers but to also motivate them well so that they could be efficient, they could be effective. So they provide them handsome wages, they provide them good allowances so that they could retain these workers and ensure that they are working efficiently. Right? Many a times, and in fact most of the cases, these workers have access to social security schemes like the Provident Fund scheme. I hope now you recall my discussion on Employee Provident Fund organization and Employee Provident Fund accounts in the last session that we had. Let me take you back a little. Here I talked about EPF enrollments and I have described how this is used as a proxy to calculate unemployment rates in an economy. Now, in unorganized sector, owners and employees of small organization, for example, a small dhaba owner somewhere in your vicinity, that is an example of an unorganized sector. Or maybe a shopkeeper who has also hired two other workers to assist him in the business. So that is an example of an unorganized sector. So small organizations, the farmers also form part of an organized sector. Casual labor. Casual labor is a labor which is not employed on a permanent basis. So that is an example of a casual labor. People who are self-employed, they are all part of the unorganized sector. Right? Many a times in the unorganized sector, the wages and allowances are less for the workers. Now please understand what I mean by this. For example, if I have started a shop and I have employed 3 workers to assist me. Let's say this is a dhaba, this is a restaurant, and I have hired 3 people to work with me. One is a chef and there are other 2 who are working as waiters. Now, most of the profit that I would be able to generate from this restaurant, I would take away for myself, and a very small amount would be left, and I would not also be willing to pay a lot to my chef, the cook, or the workers or the waiters. So this ultimately would mean that the wages and the allowance for the workers would remain low. And why am I doing this? Because I know that these people are involved in a job which does not require too many skills. They are unskilled laborers. It hardly requires any skill to be a waiter. How, of course, to be a cook you need some skills, so that could be called to be a semi-skilled kind of a work. But for waiters I need people who are unskilled. So even if these people are not happy with the wages and the allowances, or maybe with the various other benefits that I give them, they might leave, but it does not cause me any problem, because I will have so many other people who will be interested in doing this particular work, because this work does not require too many skills also. So I have a vast pool of people who would be ready to apply for this work. So even if one waiter leaves me, I'll easily be able to get another waiter. Of course, yes, it would be a little difficult for me to arrange a cook, because cook would require at least some skills. He knows how to cook food. So he's a semi-skilled labor. So naturally, if a cook goes away, then it might be a little more difficult for me to arrange a replacement for him. Fine. So because of all these things, because it is not difficult for you to arrange a replacement for these kind of workers, you generally don't worry about whether they are motivated or not, whether they are well paid or not, whether they are able to somehow provide for their family or not. And you do not try to give them handsome wages, handsome salaries and handsome allowances. Right? Also, generally, people in these sectors do not have access to any social security schemes like the Provident Fund scheme, wherein some amount would be deducted from their salary and the matching amount would be taken from the employer, and then a Provident Fund would be created for them so that they can access it in times of need in future. So no such facilities available to them. For example, in the organized sector, if you have worked for 5 years, you are eligible for a gratuity payment by the employer. So if I worked for 5 years in organized sector, I would be eligible for gratuity, which is given away as a token of gratitude for loyalty of the worker. Since the worker has been working for more than 5 years, he is basically very loyal. So as a gratitude, gratuity is paid, and it has to be paid because it is mandated by law. So there is a Gratuity Act which mandates that once the worker has completed 5 years continuously in the organization, then he is eligible for gratuity. But there is no such case with the unorganized sector. You see so many people, so many workers assisting the owners of big shops, the owners of restaurants, but they do not have any facility like Provident Fund account or a gratuity or an assurance of a gratuity once they retire from the job or once they exit the job after 5 years of working. So no such facility, no such facilities available to people in the unorganized sector, and that is the reason why I told you that it's not very advisable, it's not very good for the economy to have a predominant share of unorganized sector in the overall economy. Fine. Again, let me give you another example. These workers in the organized sector, they have got some leaves. That is not the case here. They've got some paid leaves, which means maybe for 12 days or 14 days they can remain absent from the work, but their money would not be deducted, their salary would not be deducted. So they are example of paid leaves. No such facility many a times is available in unorganized sector. Fine. For example, if there's a maid which has been employed by you, नौकरानी आपने रखी है अगर, that she is basically part of an organized sector, but are you going to pay her for these days of the month in which she has not come for work? You are not going to pay her for that. Do you maintain a provident fund account for her? You don't. So they are part of the unorganized sector, and since they are part of the unorganized sector, they many a times don't have access to these kind of facilities, and that is why it's not a very good thing for an economy to have a predominant role of unorganized sector. Fine. But however, a problem for India is that most of our workforce comes from the unorganized sector. They are getting employment in the organized sector. Fine. Now, as far as India is concerned, various estimates have been given by various agencies and academicians. Some of the estimates say that we need at least 70 lakhs jobs have to be generated every year so that the unemployment rates can be kept in check. There are other estimates who said no, not 70 lakhs, maybe 1 crore or maybe 2 crore jobs every year have to be generated so that the people can remain, so that the people can be given employment, can be given job, and the unemployment rates can be checked. So this is the quantum of work that the government and the civil society and the private organizations they have to do. They have to provide 70 lakh jobs every year. Then only we will be able to control our unemployment rates, and then only we will be able to cater to the job requirements of our vast population. Because if we are not able to do that, what might happen? Those people who do not get a job, don't you think they might indulge in some kind of crimes? They might indulge in riots, RIOTS, dange. They might commit crimes, and ultimately this would cause a lot of tension in the society. There are people, you have heard of instances of chain snatching in places as close to us as Haldwani. Why? Because there are people who are not able to earn anything, who are not able to bag a job. So naturally what they will have to do then, they will do something to earn their bread and butter, and many a times they get involved in these kind of crimes. Now let us talk about the various causes of unemployment in India. The first cause is jobless growth. I hope you remember, and you would be also talking about this in the Unit 5, wherein we will be talking about the 91 industrial policy. After industrial policy of 1991, Indian economy opened up. LPG, liberalization, privatization and globalization. However, we opened up as an economy, we started moving from the leftist economic bent towards the rightist economic bent. We started becoming more and more open. We shifted a little towards being a capitalist kind of an economy, which very minimal role for the command and control kind of economy. All these concepts we have discussed in Unit 2. So this happened in 1991, which ultimately led to an increase in the growth of GDP growth rate. So GDP growth rate you would find after 1991, there was a sudden spike in the GDP growth rate of the economy, right? But despite this, we were not able to witness a similar kind of growth in jobs. So though there was a growth in the GDP, the jobs were much less. The growth in the jobs was much less. Fine. Can I take you back a little to what I had talked about, wherein in Unit 1, wherein I discussed about this particular aspect, wherein I told you that in the service sector 31% only of the jobs are generated. However, the contribution is 61%. So they are contributing more to the GDP, but they are not contributing as much to the employment, right? So what basically happened was that there was a growth in the service sector, then there was a growth also to an extent in the manufacturing sector. So there was growth in GDP also, but the was not equivalent growth in the number of jobs which got generated in the economy, right? So this is another issue which happened. The reason was a lot of mechanization took place, specifically in the manufacturing industries. A lot of mechanization took place. Mechanization means you are now becoming a capital intensive industry where a lot of machines are being used to do the production. So naturally many of the jobs will be lost. So this was one reason for the jobless growth after 1981. Second, there was a lot of decrease in the public sector employment. What do you mean by public sector employment? Working with government organizations, government agencies. For example, I am working here in the Government Degree College, Pithoragarh. I am a government servant. So this is an example of public sector organization. Those who are working in PSU banks, they are example of public sector employment. The bureaucrats, the tehsildars, the SDMs, the district magistrates, the education officer, the district horticulture officer, the district industries officer, they are all examples of public sector employees, and they are actually benefiting from public sector employment. But slowly, since the government didn't have much money to spend on wages and salaries, so there is a slow and gradual decline in number of jobs available in the public sector. And this is the reason why in the last few years you might have found that there is a lot of clamor for reservation. Even those communities who are forward communities, who are much more developed than the other communities. For example, earlier there was reservation provided to the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. Why? Because they remained backward. Because of historical reasons, they remained backward because of the oppression that they had to face, the exploitation they had to face. They remained backward. So, just to improve their condition, there was a provision of reservation for these sections. But now, there's a clamor for reservation among the more advanced communities also. For example, only a few months back, India, we have implemented the reservation for EWS, economically weaker section, and many of these people come from the general castes. They are not OBCs, they are not SCs and STs. They are considered to be more developed communities, and they are coming from those communities. Likewise, in Maharashtra, you might have found that the Maratha reservation is being talked about. Gurjars and Meenas in Rajasthan and adjoining areas, they are asking for reservation. Why are they asking for reservation? Because they know that the public sector employment is limited. Only a few number of jobs are available in public sector employment, and once they get reservation, they would be able to corner a share of that employment in the public sector, right? And this is happening in the last few years. This is a phenomenon that has been witnessed in the last few years. Now again, another big reason, I would call it an even more important reason behind the jobless growth was that the labor intensive secondary sector, manufacturing sector, I said this earlier also when we were discussing unit 2 and we talked about the contribution of the primary, secondary and tertiary sector to economy, to the GDP and to the generation of jobs in the economy. There also I said that the labor intensive sector, if you compare the secondary and the tertiary sector, you would find that secondary sector, the manufacturing sector is more labor intensive. There you tend to use more workers than machines, and that is why if the manufacturing sector performs well, there will be a lot of jobs generated, but if they do not perform well, their generation of jobs would be much slower. And this is what has happened in India in the last few decades. Our manufacturing sector has not been able to grow, right? Let me take you back a little just to make this point clearer to you. I hope you remember. I have shown you that despite so many incentives, so many schemes, the manufacturing sector is still not contributing a lot to employment as well as to GDP. So our manufacturing sector could not grow well, while we have seen that the service sector has grown really well. Because of it, there are jobs generated, but since the service sector is more capital intensive, the number of jobs generated is much less. Service sector like software industries, they are more capital intensive, so number of jobs which have been generated in the service sector is much less, right? Again, another reason for unemployment as far as India is concerned is economic slump in export markets. Now, why does it matter? See, for example, in India, textiles and gems and jewelries. We export them a lot. As far as textiles are concerned, we are among the major exporters and we export them to different countries. We also export leather and leather goods to different countries. Not only this, we also export gems and jewelries. So we import gems and jewelries and then we polish them, and they are polished in Surat and Mumbai, and then they are exported to foreign markets. Now what will happen if there is a slump in the economic slump in the export market? Let me give an example of 2009. What happened in America? There was economic slowdown. Now naturally, if there is an economic slowdown in America, what will happen? Americans would reduce their consumption. They would only start consuming what is a necessity for them. So they would consume on food, but they would reduce their expenditure on clothing, for example. And if this happens, and supposing India is exporting clothes, textiles to US, what will happen? Think a little and answer. You can pause the video here. What happened? In 2009, when this happened in America, there was an economic slump. They reduced their expenditure. The people over there, the customers over there reduced their expenditure. Naturally, the demand of Indian textile also got reduced. And when this would happen, what will happen? The jobs which were there in the textile sector would be lost. Why? Because there is not much requirement of increase in production, because there are no customers as such in the US market or in the other export markets. So you have to reduce the production. And how do you reduce the production? You will have to fire some of the employees. And there was a lot of instances of job losses seen during that period in India also. Now what could be the solutions? Number one is you have to prioritize the manufacturing sector. So we have seen why prioritizing manufacturing sector is important. It is more labor intensive. If you compare it with services, by and large it is more labor intensive. So it's important for you to prioritize the manufacturing sector. If the manufacturing sector goes, more number of jobs will be generated. And that is why government has come up with Make in India scheme, wherein the government is asking not only the foreign manufacturers to come to India and set up their shops. For example, Samsung has opened up its production unit here in India. There are so many car companies which have opened up their assembly units here in India. Apple, for example, and companies like Samsung have come to India. There are so many mobile manufacturers which are setting up their factories in India. So Make in India is trying to incentivize these people, attract these entities, foreign manufacturers to come to India and set their factories here in India. Not only this, it is also focusing on ensuring that the Indian manufacturers, like for example the Tatas, the Reliance, they also, rather than setting up a factory somewhere in some foreign country, they also set up their factories here in India only, so that more number of jobs could be generated in the economy. So this is what the objective behind Make in India scheme is. And very recently government has started under the Atmanirbhar Abhiyan, which was launched in the wake of the corona pandemic in the last financial year, a production linked incentive scheme wherein the government is incentivizing private firms on the basis of their volumes of productions. So the more they produce, the more would be the incentive which would be given to the firms by the government. And what is the reason behind this? If attracted by incentives, these companies start increasing their production in India, naturally they would have to hire more number of people and more jobs would be generated. So this is number one. Second is we need to focus on labor intensive industries. Like within manufacturing, textile is labor intensive, leather and leather goods manufacturing, labor intensive, right? Handlooms, labor intensive. Gems and jewelry polishing again is an example of labor intensive industry. Again, there could be labor intensive industries in the service sector. For example, construction and tourism. Tourism is very, very labor intensive. Now please understand, construction and tourism basically belong to the service sector. Fine. However, they are still, though most of the service sector industries, they are not labor intensive, but these industries are labor intensive. And that is why I am saying that we need to incentivize these industries which are more labor intensive, be it from manufacturing like textile, leather, handlooms or gems and jewelries, be it from construction or tourism and other service sector entities. Again, we need to also understand that there is a limit to the number of jobs that can be generated in the government sector. It is the private sector which has to generate most of the jobs, and that is why a lot of emphasis here is on incentivizing the private sector. For example, we have talked about Make in India scheme and the PLI scheme. There is a lot of emphasis on ease of doing business, so that these private enterprises, they are able to conduct their business easily without any hassles in the country, because the easier we make it for them to conduct their business, the more number of jobs will be generated in the economy. So we need to incentivize the private sector to contribute major share of growth in the unemployment. One last thing which is remaining is that we need to also encourage self-employment, and that is why you see that many of the government schemes have now started talking about self-employment. We talked about how training of rural youth for self-employment was started as an initiative to reduce poverty and to provide self-employment opportunities to the rural youth. This was earlier, and we had talked about this when we talked about poverty. But nowadays also, for example, Stand Up India, Startup India, this is an example of how government wants private entrepreneurs to come up, because they would not only be starting their own venture, but they would no longer remain job seekers. In fact, they might turn job providers. So for example, if you start your own dairy unit, you might soon become a job provider. You might soon start engaging, employing people. So that is why there is a lot of stress on self-employment nowadays, and government has come up with various schemes, including Startup India and Stand Up India, to encourage these particular kind of enterprises, self-employment enterprises, and to encourage the sense of self-employment among the Indian youth. So with this, we come to the close of this particular unit. In the next unit that we'll discuss, we'll talk about the industrial policies. Thank you very much for your time.